We need to make it easier for the monarch to just simply strip the titles of people that they don't think are representing them in an appropriate manner.
Something about this moment feels less like a routine royal update and more like a quiet shockwave moving through the very core of the monarchy. Because when King Charles III is said to have signed a decree affecting the status of Camilla, Queen Consort, in official documents, the question is no longer just about titles. It becomes about power, control, and what may have forced such a decision to happen now. It begins not with a public announcement, but with a shift that insiders reportedly noticed first, a change so subtle on paper yet so significant in meaning that it immediately triggered whispers across Buckingham Palace, because according to details outlined in the title Queen associated with Camilla was quietly removed from official documents, replaced with more neutral language. And while this may appear administrative at first glance, those who understand how the monarchy operates know that nothing at this level happens without a deeper reason. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this. When a title as powerful as Queen is adjusted within official records, is it ever just a technical update, or is it always a signal of something happening beneath the surface? Because this is where the story begins to deepen. Because according to reports, this decision did not emerge in isolation. It followed a closed-door meeting that many insiders now describe as unusually tense. A meeting where the future of the monarchy was discussed openly, and where Prince William reportedly took a much firmer stance than expected, particularly when it came to the role of Catherine, Princess of Wales, in the next phase of royal leadership. And this is where the atmosphere inside that room is said to have changed instantly. Because when discussions turned toward elevating Catherine's future role, Camilla reportedly objected strongly, expressing the belief that her position should remain unchanged for as long as possible. And while this has not been officially confirmed, multiple accounts suggest that the exchange that followed was far more direct than what is usually seen within royal settings. So now the question becomes sharper. When two visions of the monarchy collide, one focused on continuity, the other on transition, what happens next? Because this is where the tension reportedly reached a new level. Because according to Prince William did not remain silent, instead emphasizing that the discussion was not about personal position, but about the future of the monarchy itself, a statement that, if accurate, signals a much more assertive role from the future king than many had previously assumed. But here's where things become even more interesting. Because throughout this reported exchange, King Charles III is said to have remained largely silent, observing rather than intervening. And that silence may be one of the most important details in this entire story, because in a system where authority is usually clear and structured, silence from the monarch can carry as much weight as a direct decision. Now ask yourself this. When a king chooses not to intervene during a critical moment, is he allowing the situation to unfold naturally, or is he already considering a response that will come later? Because what followed suggests the answer may not be simple. Because in the days after that meeting, according to reports something began to change inside the palace, not in a loud or visible way, but in subtle shifts that those within the system immediately recognized, as advisors who had previously supported a smooth transition toward Prince William and Catherine reportedly began altering their positions, advocating instead for a stronger continued role for Camilla. And this is where the story starts to take a different turn. Because when experienced advisors change direction suddenly, it raises a question that cannot be ignored. Why? Because institutional loyalty does not usually shift overnight without cause. So now pause again and ask yourself this. When multiple voices within a system begin to align in a new direction at the same time, is that coincidence? Or is there something influencing that change? Because this is exactly where suspicion begins to grow within the narrative. Because according to the same accounts, decisions that once followed established procedures reportedly began to shift, with proposals favoring Camilla gaining momentum while those aligned with Prince William's long-term vision were delayed or quietly set aside. And this is where the internal balance of the monarchy begins to look less stable than it appears from the outside. But here's the part that changes everything. Because if these reports are even partially accurate, then what we are seeing is not just a disagreement, but a system under pressure, one where influence, loyalty, and future direction are all being tested at the same time. And that is exactly the kind of situation that can lead to a decisive move from the top. So now the question becomes unavoidable. Was the reported decree from King Charles III a reaction to what was happening behind the scenes, or was it part of a larger plan already in motion? Because that distinction changes how this entire moment is understood. And this is where the role of Prince William becomes even more significant, because as the future king, his influence is not just about the present, it is about shaping what comes next. And if he is already taking a more active role in defining that future, then moments like this may not be isolated. They may be signals. Signals of a transition that is already underway. Now ask yourself this: are we witnessing a temporary internal conflict, or the early stages of a power shift that will redefine the monarchy in the years ahead? Because that is where this story begins to move next. And what comes next is where the tension stops building quietly and starts becoming impossible to ignore. As the initial shock of the reported decree begins to settle, the story doesn't calm down. It becomes more complex, because once you move beyond the headline and start examining what may have led King Charles III to take such a step regarding Camilla, Queen Consort, a deeper pattern begins to emerge, one that is not just about titles, but about influence, loyalty, and the fragile balance of power inside the monarchy. And according to the narrative described in This Is Where the Situation starts to feel less like a single decision and more like the result of something that had been building quietly for weeks. Because here's what makes this moment different. It wasn't just the decree itself that raised concern, it was what reportedly happened before it. Because according to multiple accounts, following that closed-door meeting where tension surfaced between Prince William and Camilla, subtle but noticeable changes began to ripple through Buckingham Palace. Changes that did not come with announcements, but were felt through behavior, through decisions, and through the sudden shift in how key advisors were positioning themselves within internal discussions. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this: when experienced royal advisors suddenly change their stance on major decisions, is that ever random, or does it usually point to something happening behind the scenes? Because that question sits at the center of this entire phase of the story. And this is where things begin to take a more uncomfortable turn. Because according to the details outlined in advisors who had previously supported a clear and structured transition toward Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales reportedly began advocating for a stronger and more extended role for Camilla, emphasizing stability, experience, and continuity. And while that argument may sound reasonable on the surface, the speed and consistency of this shift raised questions among those who were closely observing the situation. Because change inside the monarchy is usually slow, careful, deliberate. But this felt different. So now the question becomes sharper. What could cause such a rapid and coordinated shift in perspective among individuals who rarely change direction without strong reason? Because this is where suspicion reportedly begins to take shape, particularly for Prince William, who, according to the narrative, started noticing that decisions were no longer following the patterns he had come to expect, with proposals aligned with his long-term vision being delayed, while those favoring Camilla seemed to move forward with unusual ease. And that is where the situation becomes more than just internal disagreement. It becomes a question of influence. Now pause again and ask yourself this: when decisions within a system begin to consistently favor one direction without clear explanation, is that natural alignment, or is it something more controlled? Because this is exactly where the tension begins to escalate. Because according to internal meetings started to reflect this shift more clearly, with advisors presenting arguments that echoed similar language, emphasizing the need for continuity under Camilla's presence, while subtly downplaying the readiness of Catherine. And this repetition of messaging, if accurate, suggests a level of coordination that is difficult to ignore. But here's where the story takes a sharper turn. Because if this shift was not organic, then it raises a much bigger question about what might have influenced it. And this is where the narrative introduces a more serious possibility. Because according to reports, Prince William began to suspect that something was happening outside the official structure, something not recorded in meeting minutes, something not visible in formal discussions, but something that was nevertheless shaping outcomes in a way that could not be explained by normal process. And that changes everything. Because once unofficial influence enters the equation, the integrity of the system itself comes into question. Now ask yourself this: if decisions inside an institution begin to reflect forces that are not officially acknowledged, how long can that institution maintain its credibility? Because credibility, once questioned, is difficult to restore. And this is where the emotional dimension begins to return. Because for Prince William, this is not just about policy or procedure. It is about trust. Trust in advisors. Trust in process. Trust in the system he is expected to lead in the future. And if that trust begins to erode, even slightly, it creates a situation that cannot simply be ignored. But here's the part that makes this even more critical. Because while all of this is happening internally, there is still no public acknowledgement from King Charles III, no visible attempt to address the shifting dynamics. And that silence is starting to carry its own weight, because in moments of uncertainty, silence can be interpreted in many different ways. So now the question becomes unavoidable. Is this silence a sign that the situation is under control? Or a sign that it is more complicated than it appears? because that distinction changes everything. And this is where the reported decree begins to make more sense within the broader narrative. Because if internal dynamics were shifting in ways that threatened balance, then a decisive move from the monarch, even one that appears administrative on the surface, could be interpreted as an attempt to restore order, to reassert boundaries, or to send a message without escalating the situation publicly. But that raises another question. If this was a message, who was it intended for? Because in a system as structured as the monarchy, decisions are rarely without purpose. They are signals. And those signals are meant to be understood by those inside the system. Now pause and think about this. If a decision affects how Camilla is referenced in official documents, what kind of message does that send to those who had begun aligning themselves more closely with her position? Because this is where the story begins to move toward something even more significant. Because once a signal like this is sent, it forces a reaction. It forces realignment. It forces people to reconsider where they stand. And that is when the situation begins to shift again. But here's where the story becomes even more intense. Because if Prince William was already aware of unusual patterns within the advisory system, then the reported decree may not just be a reaction. It may be part of a larger response. A response that is still unfolding. So now ask yourself this. Are we looking at a single decision made in isolation, or are we witnessing the early stages of a coordinated effort to restore control within the monarchy? Because that is where this story is heading next. And what happens next is where the tension moves from suspicion to something much harder to ignore. As the internal shifts begin to move from suspicion into something far more concrete, the story takes a sharper turn, because what once felt like subtle changes inside Buckingham Palace now starts to look like a coordinated pattern. And according to the narrative outlined in, this is exactly the moment where Prince William begins to move from observation to action, not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly and deliberately, in a way that suggests he already understood the seriousness of what he might uncover. Because here's what changes everything. It wasn't just the shift in advisor behavior that raised concerns. It was the consistency of that shift. Because when multiple advisors, individuals with years of loyalty and experience within the monarchy, begin aligning their positions in the same direction, using similar language, supporting the same outcomes, and doing so within a very short period of time, it creates a pattern that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this. When patterns inside a system become too consistent, does that indicate natural agreement, or does it suggest influence operating behind the scenes? Because that question is exactly where this story begins to deepen. And this is where Prince William reportedly decided that waiting was no longer an option, because according to accounts referenced in, he began holding private conversations with trusted individuals, attempting to understand what had caused such a sudden shift, and what he found was not clarity, but resistance, hesitation, and answers that did not fully explain what was happening. And that hesitation matters. Because in a system built on structure and protocol, clarity is expected. Consistency is expected. And when those expectations are not met, it signals that something is wrong. So now the question becomes sharper. If the answers being given do not match the changes being observed, what is being left unsaid? Because this is where suspicion begins to turn into something more tangible. Because according to the same narrative, Prince William started noticing that certain advisors were no longer fully present in his own discussions, while appearing more frequently in smaller, less visible meetings elsewhere, meetings that were not part of the usual structure, meetings that were not documented in the same way as official sessions. And that is where the story takes a decisive turn. Because once meetings begin happening outside official channels, the system itself is no longer operating as expected. Now pause again and ask yourself this. When key decisions begin to form outside the official framework, who is actually controlling the direction of that system? Because this is where the narrative begins to point towards something more serious. Because according to, there were indications that Camilla, Queen Consort, may have been engaging directly with advisors in private settings, outside formal meetings. And while these reports remain unverified, they have become central to how this entire situation is being interpreted, because they suggest a level of influence that exists beyond official authority. And that changes everything. Because influence that operates outside structure is difficult to track, difficult to prove, but incredibly powerful if it exists. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If decisions are being shaped outside official channels, how long can the system maintain its integrity? Because integrity is not just about what is done. it is about how it is done. And once that process is questioned, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. But here's where the story becomes even more intense. Because according to the narrative, Prince William did not stop at observation or conversation. He began to gather information more systematically, looking for patterns, looking for connections, looking for anything that could explain what was happening, and what he began to uncover reportedly pointed toward a network of influence that had been operating quietly but effectively. Now ask yourself this: if someone begins to uncover a pattern that suggests hidden influence, what is the next logical step? Because the answer to that question leads directly to confrontation. And confrontation changes everything. Because once a situation moves from suspicion to confrontation, it can no longer remain hidden. It forces clarity. It forces decisions. And it forces consequences. And this is where the role of King Charles III becomes even more significant, because as the monarch, he is the one who ultimately defines how such a situation is resolved, whether through quiet adjustment or decisive action. And the reported decree removing Camilla's title from official documents begins to look less like an isolated decision and more like a response to something that had already reached a critical point internally. So now the question becomes even more direct. Was the decree a reaction to what Prince William had uncovered, or was it part of a larger effort to regain control before the situation escalated further? Because that distinction matters. Because it determines whether this moment is reactive or strategic. And that changes how the entire story is understood. But here's where the emotional dimension returns. Because beyond structure, beyond influence, beyond power, there is something else at play here. Trust. Because once trust between individuals within a system begins to break down, even slightly, it creates a ripple effect that extends far beyond the immediate situation, affecting relationships, decisions, and the future direction of the institution itself. So now ask yourself this: if trust within the royal family has been strained by what has happened, what kind of impact does that have on what comes next? Because that is where this story is heading. Not toward resolution, but toward a moment where everything that has been building beneath the surface begins to surface fully. And when that moment arrives, it will not be subtle. It will be decisive. As the situation moves from quiet investigation into something far more exposed, the tone of the story changes completely. Because once what was hidden begins to surface, it no longer remains a question of suspicion, it becomes a question of response. And according to the narrative outlined in, this is exactly the phase where everything inside Buckingham Palace starts to feel heavier, more tense, and far less controllable than before, especially for Prince William, who is now no longer just observing patterns but confronting what those patterns may actually mean. Because here's where everything begins to accelerate. It is one thing to suspect that influence exists behind the scenes. It is another thing entirely to begin connecting those suspicions into something that resembles a structure, something that suggests intention rather than coincidence. And this is where, according to reports, Prince William's internal efforts begin to shift from quiet conversations into something more deliberate, something that signals he is no longer willing to allow uncertainty to define the situation. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this: when a future king begins to act not out of curiosity, but out of concern for the stability of the monarchy, what kind of pressure does that create inside the system? Because that pressure is exactly what begins to spread. And this is where the narrative becomes even more intense. Because according to, once certain testimonies and internal observations started to align, the situation reportedly moved toward a more formal confrontation, not public, not visible to the outside world, but serious enough to involve the highest levels of the royal structure. And this is where the story shifts from internal tension to institutional crisis. Because when conversations move into private council settings, the stakes are no longer personal. They are systemic. And that changes everything. So now the question becomes sharper. If the internal balance of influence within the monarchy is being challenged, who ultimately decides how that challenge is resolved? Because the answer to that question leads directly to King Charles III. And this is where his role becomes unavoidable. Because according to the narrative, once the full scope of what had been happening was presented, whether through testimonies, patterns, or internal findings, King Charles was placed in a position where silence was no longer an option, where the need to protect the integrity of the monarchy began to outweigh the desire to avoid confrontation. But here's where things become even more complex. Because any decision involving Camilla, Queen Consort, is not just institutional. It is deeply personal. Because her position is tied not only to the monarchy, but to King Charles himself, to their shared history, to the years of public scrutiny and private loyalty that define their relationship, and that makes any action involving her role far more complicated than a standard procedural adjustment. Now ask yourself this. When a decision requires choosing between personal loyalty and institutional stability, what carries more weight? Because that is the dilemma at the heart of this moment. And this is where the reported decree begins to take on a different meaning. Because if King Charles III did indeed move to remove the Queen designation from official documents, then it may not simply be a reaction to a single issue, but part of a broader attempt to recalibrate the balance within the monarchy, to signal that certain boundaries cannot be crossed without consequence, even at the highest levels. But here's where the tension rises even further. Because decisions like this do not exist in isolation. They create ripple effects. They force alignment. They expose divisions. And according to, the aftermath of these developments began to reveal just how deep those divisions might be, with advisors, staff, and internal factions quietly reassessing their positions, their loyalties, and their understanding of where power truly lies within the royal structure. So now pause again and ask yourself this. When a system begins to reorganize itself in response to internal pressure, does that signal strength, or does it reveal vulnerability? Because perception begins to shift in moments like this. And perception, within a monarchy, is everything. But here's where the story becomes even more revealing. Because while King Charles represents the present, Prince William represents the future, and according to many observers, this entire situation may be shaping how that future will be defined, particularly in terms of how authority is exercised, how boundaries are enforced, and how the monarchy adapts to internal challenges. And that changes the stakes entirely. Because this is no longer just about what has happened. It is about what will happen next. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If Prince William is already stepping into a more assertive role, even informally, what does that mean for how similar situations will be handled when he becomes king? Because that question does not just belong to the future. It is influencing the present. And that is why this moment feels so significant. Because it sits at the intersection of transition, between one style of leadership and another, between restraint and action, between silence and decision. And that intersection is rarely stable. Now ask yourself this. Are we witnessing a temporary crisis that will eventually settle, or are we seeing the early signs of a structural shift that will redefine the monarchy itself? Because that is where this story is heading, into its final phase, where everything that has been building quietly beneath the surface begins to collide in a way that can no longer be contained. And when that happens, the outcome will not just resolve this situation, it will define what comes next. As everything now converges into its final phase, the story no longer feels like a quiet internal dispute. It begins to resemble a defining moment for the monarchy itself, because once influence, loyalty, authority, and public perception all collide at the same time, what follows is rarely subtle. And according to the narrative outlined in, this is exactly where the situation surrounding King Charles III and Camilla, Queen Consort, reaches its most critical point, not because of what has already been revealed, but because of what it implies about what comes next. Because here's what changes everything. Once a decision, whether administrative or symbolic, affects how a figure like Camilla is referenced within official documents, it doesn't just remain on paper, it reshapes perception, it signals direction, and it forces everyone within the system to reconsider where they stand. And that is exactly why this moment is being interpreted not just as a protocol adjustment, but as a message. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this. When a monarch allows a shift like this to take place, is he resolving a problem, or is he preparing the system for something larger? Because that distinction defines how this entire story is understood. And this is where the role of Prince William becomes even more central, because as the future king, his influence is no longer something that exists only in the background. It is beginning to shape the present, particularly in moments where the long-term stability of the monarchy appears to be at risk. And if the reports suggesting his involvement in raising concerns are accurate, then what we are seeing now may not just be a reaction. It may be the early expression of a different style of leadership, one that is less willing to tolerate ambiguity. Now ask yourself this. If a future king begins influencing decisions before officially taking the throne, what does that mean for the balance of power within the monarchy today? Because that question leads directly into the heart of this final phase. Because once internal tensions reach a point where decisions must be made, the outcome is rarely neutral. It creates alignment on one side and distance on the other. And according to, the aftermath of these developments has already begun to reflect that shift, with internal dynamics quietly reorganizing. As advisors reassess loyalties and positions begin to stabilize under a new understanding of where authority ultimately resides. But here's where the emotional dimension returns with full force. Because beyond structure and strategy, this situation involves real relationships, particularly between King Charles III and Camilla, Queen Consort, a relationship shaped by years of shared experience, public scrutiny, and personal loyalty. And when decisions intersect with that kind of history, they carry a weight that goes far beyond institutional necessity. So now the question becomes even more difficult. When the needs of the monarchy and the realities of personal relationships collide, is it ever possible to resolve one without affecting the other? Because that is the dilemma at the center of this entire story. And that is what makes this moment feel so significant. Because it is not just about what has happened. It is about what it represents. A shift. A recalibration. A signal that the monarchy may be entering a new phase, one where authority is being redefined, where boundaries are being clarified, and where the balance between tradition and modern reality is being renegotiated in real time. Now pause again and ask yourself this. Are we witnessing a controlled evolution of the monarchy, or are we seeing the early signs of a deeper fracture that could reshape everything moving forward? Because that question does not have an immediate answer. And that uncertainty is exactly what keeps this story alive. But here's where everything comes together. Because regardless of how this situation is interpreted, one thing is clear. The monarchy cannot remain unchanged. Not after moments like this. Not after tensions like this. Not after decisions that carry this level of meaning. And that means the future is already being shaped. Not in announcements. Not in ceremonies. But in moments like this. Quiet. Subtle. But powerful. So now it comes down to you. After everything you've heard, after looking at the role of King Charles III, the position of Camilla, Queen Consort, and the growing influence of Prince William, do you see this as a necessary step to protect the future of the monarchy, or as a sign of deeper instability within the royal family itself? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective matters here. And if you want more high-retention breakdowns that go beyond headlines and reveal the real dynamics shaping the royal family, make sure to subscribe, stay engaged, and don't miss what comes next. Because the next development in this story may not just add to the narrative. It might completely redefine it.